Hello friends, we'll be understanding the concept of change of supply right now. Now, with the increase or decrease in price, how this affects the supply part is something that we're going to understand. So let's understand with the theoretical part of it first. The location of a supply curve, that is the distance from the origin. That means if this is the origin and if this is the distance, this thing is known as the distance from the origin of a product is determined by the factors other than its own price, while its slope determines or rather is determined by its own price. So these thing or rather this distance can be derived out of the factors other than the price. However, the slope of this thing can be distinguished or rather can be figured out with the slope of the price itself, or rather with the price, because other things are constant there. So in other words, supply for goods changes when the specifications that we meet, that is a producer moves from one point to another on the same supply curve, movement along the supply curve. If this is the supply curve that we are talking about, let us clear this out first. So if this is the supply curve, now if this is the supply curve that we have already spoken about, a producer moves from one point to another on the supply curve. Now a producer must be moving. If the price is here, then it might go down and it might just move here, it here, something like this. The supply curve must keep on going like this, because the moment the price reduces, the supply curves also changes, and this thing has to be derived or rather can be utilized using the supply curve itself. So when the supply curve is being taught about, you need to understand the supply curve depends or is rationally or rather in a direct proportion with the price here, hence that needs to be taken into consideration. Now, the next part refers to when the entire supply curve shifts in the position, that is movement from one supply curve to other. The next part that we have to talk about is movement along the supply curve. So this whole thing that we are studying about, that is movement from one point to another on the supply curve, or rather movement of that supply curve itself, is something that we'll be understanding right now. The first part refers to movement along the supply curve. An increase in price will increase the quantity supplied, that is obvious. But a decrease in price will reduce the quantity supplied, that is again correct. The supply curve is positively sloped upwards and to the right as against the demand curve, which is negatively sloped. Demand curve is negatively sloped, that we have already understood. Positive slope is the supply one, hence it is moved towards upward side. Hence if it is like this, that means if this is the curve is like this, it's a little steep. However, if it is declined, if the prices keep on declining, it too will become very steep. That is the difference between the supply curve and the demand curve, that is the positive and the negative side of it. Now the next part refers to a reduction in the quantity of supply on account of decrease in price is termed as contraction in supply. In this case, the supplier moves downwards along the supply curve. In contrast, if the price of the good is moved or rather rises, the supply moves or rather the supplier moves upwards along the supply curve. So if the quantity declines, then it becomes steep. So probably if this is the supply curve on a graph, if the quantity is increasing, it will become like this. If the quantity is decreasing because of the decrease in price, it will become very steep like this. This is the major difference that you need to understand. So hence, one or rather the supply curve offers to sell more of the goods. This is termed as expansion in supply. So this is what you need to understand. The last part of this will be movement from one supply curve to another. This is what we are talking about, or rather the previous part explained about movement of supply curve on that same itself, or rather movement from one point to another point on the supply curve. Now we are talking about movement of supply curve from one point to another. If the supply curve changes without the change in the price, the supplier shifts from one supply curve to another. This is an assumption. If the price doesn't change, still the supply curve is changing. That means the position of that supplier or the producer has changed from one point to another. It is not the supply curve that is changing, or rather there is no point on the supply curve, but we are completely shifting the supply curve here. Hence, such a movement is termed as increase. This is basically termed as increase. So for example, if this is the price, or rather if this was the earlier supply curve, now the new supply curve comes like this. That means now the producer is not moving on these points anymore. The producer has went directly to these points. So these are the things that you need to keep in mind. So this is basically known as increase here. It moves from the outer supply curve to the right. So it moves to the right hand side here. and it is termed as reduction in the supply, and when the movement is to the inner supply curve to the left. When this goes on the inner side, that is on the left side, this is known as reduction. Let us assume that this is our graph. Now if this is the original supply curve, if this is the new supply curve, if this is a different supply curve, so if this one is original, let us note it down. If this is the original, this is the new, and this is the latest. So this part will be known as increase, this part will be known as decrease, and this will be the original one. So if it is going upwards, then it is increase. If it is going downwards, then it is decrease. This is what you need to understand here. So these are the things that you need to understand whenever it comes to the change in supply curve, how increase, decrease happens, and what exactly happens, or rather with increase, is there any rational change in the price or amount or not, or whether this is a complete shift of supply curve from one part to another. This is what you need to understand here. So this is all that we have in this video for your reference when it comes to change in supply. Thank you.